What caused the Spanish Civil War?
From 1936 to 1939, two sides fought for control of Spain, the nationalists and the loyalists. The insurgent nationalists were aristocrats, military leaders, Roman Catholic clergy, and members of a political group called the Phalange Party. They were supported by Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler 1889 to 1945. And Fascist Italy, under Benito Mussolini 1883 to 1945, in their effort to wrest control. The Loyalists were liberals, socialists, and communists. They were supported by the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin 1879 to 1953. A number of non-Spanish idealists, who believed saving the Republic from the fascist rebels was worth dying for, joined the ranks of the Loyalists to form the International Brigade. In his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, Ernest Hemingway 1899 to 1961, who had covered the war as a correspondent, wrote about one young American man who took up arms in behalf of the Loyalist effort. The Nationalists, under Generalissimo Francisco Franco, 1892 to 1975, won the war when they captured Madrid in March 1939, beginning an era of harsh right-wing rule. And, as with any war, the fascist victory had come at a dear price. Hundreds of thousands dead and massive destruction throughout the country.
What impact did the Challenger disaster have on the U.S. space program?
The immediate effect was that all scheduled launches were scratched. Pending the outcome of the government investigation into the disaster, President Ronald Reagan, 1911-2004, acted quickly to establish a presidential commission to look into the January 28, 1986, accident, appointing former Secretary of State William P. Rogers, 1913 to 2001, as the chair. Rogers conducted a thorough investigation involving public and private hearings. More than 6,000 people, 15,000 pages of testimony, 170,000 pages of documents, hundreds of photographs, and reports of independent technical studies. Additionally, the Commission reviewed flight records, film evidence, and the recovered debris. On June 6, 1986, the Commission released its report, citing the cause of the disaster as the failure of the O-ring seals that are intended to prevent hot gases from leaking through the joint during the propellant burn. The Commission had learned that although both the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, and the O-ring manufacturer Morton Thiokol were concerned about the seals, which had also been used on other shuttles, they had come to regard them as an acceptable risk. The Commission went on to say that the decision to launch the Challenger was flawed. The U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Science and Technology, which had spent 2 months conducting its own hearings, also concluded that the disaster could have been prevented. citing that meeting flight schedules and cutting costs were given a higher priority than flight safety. With the blame for the disaster placed on NASA's doorstep, public confidence in the agency plummeted and NASA's own astronauts became concerned that their lives had been put at risk. However, the Commission also made 9 recommendations to NASA, including redesigning the solid rocket booster joints, giving astronauts and engineers a greater role in approving launches, reviewing the astronaut escape systems, regulating the rate of shuttle flights to maximize safety, and reforming the shuttle program's management structure. A turnover of personnel, which included some astronauts, resulted at the space agency, which spent almost 3 years rebuilding. It was not until September 29, 1988, that an American shuttle again flew in space.
What was the Peace of Augsburg?
The Peace of Augsburg of 1555 came as a result of the Reformation and effectively carved up Europe between the Roman Catholic Church and the new Lutheran, Protestant, Church. Charles V, 1500 to 1558, was Holy Roman Emperor at the time, and though he hated to concede lands to Protestantism, he also wished to end the religious divisions in the empire. Princes who had themselves converted to the new faith convinced Charles to allow each prince to choose the religion for his own land. Thus, the Peace of Augsburg officially recognized the Lutheran Church and the right of the people to worship as Protestants.
What were the 7 cities of Cibola?
The reference is to an area in present-day northern New Mexico that was thought by early Spanish explorers to contain vast treasures. One expedition in search of these legendary golden cities was that led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, c. 1510 to 1554, who sought to claim the riches for Spain. In 1540 he set out from North Galicia, a province northwest of Mexico City, with some 300 Spanish troops as well as some Indians. They made it into the region where Arizona and New Mexico lie today. There they encountered Zuni Indian settlements and believed these to be Cibola. The Spaniards captured the Zuni, who were the descendants of the Anasazi cliff dwellers that had settled the southwest as early as 10,000 BC. The Spaniards found no gold at the Zuni settlement. Separate expeditions set out, still hoping to locate riches in the area. They did not find any precious metals, but they did make some discoveries. They were the first Europeans to see the Grand Canyon, to travel up the Rio Grande Valley, and to encounter several native peoples living in the region. In 1546 Coronado was accused of cruelty in his treatment of these peoples.
What is the conflict over Chechnya?
Since the 1990s, separatist factions have been fighting for the independence of the tiny Russian Republic. At just more than 6,000 square miles in area, it is about the size of Hawaii. Chechnya's population falls into three main ethnic groups: Chechens, the majority, Ingush, and Russian. The religion of the Chechen and the Ingush peoples is Islam, while the Russian population is mostly Orthodox Christian. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, the region remained with the new Russian Federation as the Chechen Ingush Republic. But dissent grew, and in 1991 a rebel faction led by Jakar Dudayev, 1944 to 1996, took control of the government. Chechnya separated from Ingushetia to form two separate republics in 1992. In 1994, Russian troops invaded to reclaim the Chechen capital of Grozny, an oil and manufacturing center. By this time, two factions existed among the rebels. One was a nationalist movement and the other a fundamentalist Islamic movement. In 1995 the conflict spilled over into neighboring regions, as Chechen militants began a series of terror attacks. In June of that year, gunmen seized a hospital in Budyanovsk, about 90 miles north of the Chechen border, in the Stavropol territory, and held 1,800 people hostage for 6 days. More than 100 people were killed and hundreds were injured. In 1996, Chechen terrorists seized another hospital, holding 2,000 hostages. This time in neighboring Dagestan, at least 23 people were killed. Russia's military strikes in Chechnya continued until a ceasefire was negotiated in 1996, by which time dissident leader Dudayev had been killed. Even after a peace treaty was signed in 1997, ending the First Chechen War, the status of Russia's breakaway republic remained unclear. In 1999 the battle over Chechnya's status was taken straight to the Russian capital of Moscow, where 5 bombings in 4 weeks claimed 300 lives. Islamic militants in Chechnya were blamed. The Kremlin responded with force, leveling Grozny by early 2000 and displacing 250,000 people from their homes. A pro-Moscow administration was put into place. Violence related to the Chechen conflict continued throughout Russia. Suicide bombings alone claimed more than 260 lives between 2002 and 2004. There were large-scale assaults as well. In October 2002, Chechen militants took more than 700 people hostage at a Moscow theater. After a 2-day standoff, Russian special forces stormed the building, killing 41 Chechen fighters and 129 hostages. In August 2004, 2 airliners crashed within minutes of each other after taking off from the same airport. 90 people died in the crashes, which Russian President Vladimir Putin, 1952, labeled terrorism. And on September 1, 2004, 32 armed militants seized an elementary school in Beslan, North Ossetia, a region bordering Chechnya. The terrorists held some 1,200 hostages for 48 hours, at which time Russian forces stormed the building, 335 people died, most of them children. Leaders of the Chechen nationalist movement distanced themselves from the terrorist acts, the responsibility for which were claimed by a militant Chechen Muslim group. Chechnya continued to be unstable, with Putin resolved to a hardline approach to the breakaway republic. In elections held in March 2003, voters reportedly approved a new constitution that declared Chechnya to be part of Russia. But critics found the election results irregular, with almost 96% of voters expressing support for the referendum. Months later, pro-Moscow leadership was elected in the person of Deputy Prime Minister Ramzan Kadyrov. Critics called it a puppet regime. In March 2005, Chechen nationalist leader Aslan Moskatov, 1951–2005, was killed in a Russian assault. His death was seen as a victory for Moscow. Moskatov, who had briefly been president. 1997–1999, of an independent Chechnya, was generally viewed as a moderate who believed an honest dialogue between the two sides could bring an end to the decade-long conflict.
What was the Niagara movement?
It was a short-lived but important African-American organization that advocated the total integration of blacks into mainstream society, with all the rights, privileges, and benefits of other Americans. Founded in Niagara Falls, Ontario, in 1905, the Niagara movement was led by writer, scholar, and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868–1963, who was then a professor of economics and history at Atlanta University. Observers described the organization as the anti-Bookerite camp. Educator Booker T. Washington, 1856–1915, who rose from slavery to found Alabama's Tuskegee Institute. 1881, believed change for black people should be effected through education and self-improvement, not through demand. Mr. Washington opposed the social and political agitation favored by some reformers. The Niagara movement, on the other hand, placed the responsibility for the nation's racial problems squarely on the shoulders of its white population. The 30 branches of the Niagara movement challenged conservative politics of the so-called Tuskegee machine led by Booker T. Washington. Though the Niagara organization dissolved in 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was heir to its ideology and activism. Du Bois helped found that organization, and from 1910 to 1934 edited its official journal, The Crisis, in which he published his views on nearly every important social issue that confronted the black community.
How did the word Machiavellian get its meaning?
Machiavellian is defined as characterized by cunning, duplicity, or bad faith. It's based on the theory of Italian diplomat Niccolò Machiavelli, 1469–1527. who developed a code of political conduct that operates independent of ethics, thus disregarding moral authorities such as classical philosophy and Christian theology. In 1513, after having been exiled from Florence, Italy, by the powerful Medici family, Machiavelli abruptly turned his attention to writing The Prince, which puts forth a calm and uncompromising analysis of techniques and methods that the successful ruler must use in order to gain and keep power. Written in the form of advice to the ruler, Machiavelli advises the prince that only one consideration should govern his decisions: the effectiveness of a particular course of action, regardless of its ethical character. The book had little immediate impact in Italy, although it soon became legendary throughout Europe. And its major ideas, the power of politics, are familiar today even to people who have never read the book.
Why does the music of Bartók figure prominently in concert programs today?
Béla Bartók, 1881–1945, is revered today not only for his ability as a pianist. His teacher compared him to Franz Liszt (1811–1886), who was perhaps the greatest pianist of the 19th century. But for his compositions, which are steeped in the tradition of Hungarian folk music, Bartók studied and analyzed Hungarian, Romanian, and Arabian folk tunes, publishing thousands of collections of them in his lifetime. While ethnic music had influenced the works of other composers, Bartók was the first to make it an integral part of art music composition. His works were unique in that the folk music provided the sheer essence and substance of the music, lending the compositions a primitive quality. Among his masterpieces are his three stage works, the ballets The Wooden Prince and The Miraculous Mandarin, and the one-act opera Duke Bluebeard's Castle. The introduction of folk music as the core of a musical composition has had far-reaching influence, which must have been felt by American composer Aaron Copland, 1900–1990. Whose Appalachian Spring, 1944, features a simple shaker tune, front and center.
What caused the Spanish-American War?
The 1898 War, which lasted only a matter of months, late April to mid-August, was fought over the liberation of Cuba. During the 1870s, the Cuban people rebelled against Spanish rule. But once that long rebellion had been put down, peace on the Caribbean island did not hold. Worsening economic conditions prompted revolution in 1895. American leaders, the bloody American Civil War. 1861–65, still in their memories, feared that while the Cuban rebels could not win their battle against the Spanish, neither were the Spanish strong enough to fully put down the insurrection. Meanwhile, the American public, fed by a steady stream of newspaper accounts reporting oppressive conditions on the island, increasingly supported U.S. intervention in the Cuban conflict. In November 1897 President William McKinley, 1843–1901, did intervene. But it was through political, rather than military, pressure. As a result, Spain granted Cuba limited self-government within the Spanish Empire. However, the move did not satisfy the Cuban rebels, who were determined to achieve independence from Spain. The fighting continued. Rioting broke out in Havana, and in order to protect Americans living there, the United States sent the battleship Maine to the port on January 25, 1898. On February 15, an explosion blew up the Maine, killing more than 200 people. Blame for the blast was promptly, and history would later conclude, wrongly assigned to Spain. While President McKinley again made several attempts to pressure Spain into granting Cuba full independence, it was to no avail. Nevertheless, on April 19, the U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution recognizing an independent Cuba, disclaiming American intention to acquire the island, and authorizing the use of the American Army and Navy to force Spanish withdrawal. On April 25, the United States formally declared that the country was at war with Spain. In the months that followed, American forces battled the Spanish and Spanish loyalists in Cuba and the Spanish-controlled Philippines. There was also military activity on Puerto Rico. However, the American forces there met little resistance. Once Santiago, Cuba, was surrendered by the Spanish after the battle at San Juan Hill in July 1898, it would only be a matter of weeks before a ceasefire was called and an armistice was signed, on August 12, ending the brief war.
When was the first movie shown?
On March 22, 1895, the first in-theater showing of a motion picture took place in Paris, when the members of the Société d'Encouragement à l'Industrie Nationale, National Society for the Promotion of Industry, gathered to see a film of workers leaving the Lumière factory at Lyons for their dinner hour. The cinematography of inventors Louis, 1864–1948, and Augusta, 1862–1954, Lumière, ages 31 and 33 respectively, was a vast improvement over the kinetoscope. Introduced in 1894 by Thomas Edison, whose film could only be viewed by one person at a time. The 16 frame per second mechanism developed by the Lumière brothers became the standard for films for decades. The following year, on April 20, 1896, the first motion picture showing in the United States took place in New York. The film was shown using Thomas Edison's Vitascope, which was an improvement on his kinetoscope, and a projector made by Thomas Armad.
What was the Chautauqua movement?
It was a cultural, religious, and political education movement that began in the 1870s and lasted into the 1920s. An estimated 45 million Americans participated in the Chautauqua, making it a dominant force in American life during its day. Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, hailed it as the most American thing in America, and, during World War I. 1914 to 18, Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, claimed that it was an integral part of the national defense. Some scholars credit the Chautauqua movement with sowing the seeds of liberal thought in America. The movement began in 1874 at a Methodist Episcopal campsite on the shores of Lake Chautauqua, New York. There a young minister named John H. Vincent, 1932 to 1920, of Camden, New Jersey, endeavored to train Sunday school teachers in a summer camp atmosphere. The program grew in popularity and was expanded beyond Bible study and religious training to include lessons in literacy, history, and sociology. Chautauqua-style summer camps, commonly called Sunday school assemblies, began popping up across the nation. All of them featured a general meeting hall or pavilion set in a campground. By 1900 there were 200 pavilions in 31 states. Attendees of all ages would attend the summer programs, which featured speakers on a wide variety of subjects, including the arts, travel, and politics. Performances also became part of the movement, with a variety of musicians and entertainers joining the lecturers. Early in the 20th century the Chautauqua became increasingly secular, and went on the road as an organized lecture and entertainment circuit. Speakers and performers traveled from town to town, where tents were set up for weeks at a time to house the summer programs. Many Americans saw their first movies in Chautauqua tents. The movement died out in the mid-1920s, with the improvement of communications and transportations. Some consider the Chautauqua the first form of American mass culture. The Chautauqua Institute in New York continues to host a summer education program in the spirit of the original.
How many U.S. presidents have been assassinated?
Four American presidents were assassinated in office: Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, was shot on the evening of April 14, 1865, as he sat in the presidential box of Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., watching a performance of Our American Cousin. The man who fired the shot was actor John Wilkes Booth, 1838 to 1865. Who then jumped onto the stage, fell, breaking a leg, and limped away, calling out, "Sic semper tyrannis," a Latin phrase meaning thus always to tyrants. The president lived through the night, attended by family. He died just after 7 a.m. On April 15, He was succeeded in office by Vice President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875. On April 26 the search party found Booth in a Virginia barn, where he was fatally shot. James Garfield, 1831 to 1881, was en route to a class reunion at Williams College, Williamstown, Massachusetts, on July 2, 1881, when his assailant fired 2 shots at him in a Washington, D.C. train station. The shooter was Charles J. Guiteau, 1841-1882, who held a grudge against the president. One of Guiteau's bullets had only grazed the president. The other was fixed in his back, and doctors were unable to locate it. Today the president's life might well have been spared, but the medical treatment of the late 1800s, which lacked both the X-ray machine and antiseptics, could not save him. He lived 80 days more, dying at a cottage on the New Jersey shore on September 19. He was succeeded in office by Vice President Chester Arthur, 1830 to 1886. Guiteau's trial lawyer would later claim that Garfield's assassin was insane, but it was an unsuccessful plea for his life. In 1882 he was convicted and hung. On September 6, 1901, President William McKinley, 1843 to 1901, was attending a reception in Buffalo, New York, where the previous day he had delivered a speech. As he approached a man to shake his hand, the fellow fired 2 shots at McKinley. One bullet delivered only a minor flesh wound, but the other lodged in his stomach. Surgeons operated, but gangrene and infection set in, claiming the president's life the morning of September 14. He was succeeded in office by Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919. The shooter was identified as avowed anarchist Leon F. Cholgaz, 1873 to 1901, he was tried, convicted, and put to death in 1901. President John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963, accompanied by his wife, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, 1929 to 1994. Traveled in a motorcade through the streets of Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963. They were en route to the Dallas Trade Mart, where the president was scheduled to make a lunchtime speech. At 12:30 p.m., shots rang out. The president, who was riding in the back seat of a convertible, was hit in the neck and head. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, where he died at 1 p.m. The nation's loss was immediately felt, as television and radio stations broadcast the message live that Kennedy had been shot and killed. He was succeeded by Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, 1908 to 1973. Who took the oath of office aboard an airplane just after 2:30 p.m. Additionally, there were assassination attempts on the lives of Presidents Andrew Jackson, April 14, 1835, Theodore Roosevelt, October 14, 1912, Franklin D. Roosevelt, February 15, 1933, Harry S. Truman, November 1, 1950, Gerald R. Ford, 2 attempts, both in September 1975, and Ronald Reagan, March 30, 1981. Theodore Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan recovered from their injuries. The others were not injured in the attempts.
What happened to the tablets on which the 10 Commandments were written?
Chapter 32 of the book of Exodus explains that while Moses was up on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments from God, the Israelites who were waiting below grew impatient, and soon prevailed upon Aaron to make us a god who will be our leader. As for the man Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him. And so Aaron did what the people wanted. He proceeded to collect gold jewelry from the Israelites and then fashioned the jewelry into a golden calf. When Moses came down the mountain, he saw the people rejoicing and dancing before the calf. Enraged, Moses threw the 2 tablets, which were inscribed on both sides, to the ground, smashing them. Later, the Bible explains, in Exodus 34:1-4, that God instructed Moses to carve new stone tablets like the other ones, which he did. These tablets were placed in the Ark of the Covenant, as God had told Moses. People sometimes see the 10 Commandments as divided into 2 groups. The first group covers the relationship between people and God, and the second covers relationships among people.
When was the first test tube baby born?
The process of in vitro, artificial, fertilization, IVF, in which doctors retrieve an egg from the mother and mix it with the father's sperm in a petri dish or test tube to achieve fertilization. Made possible the birth of Louise Brown on July 25, 1978, in Bristol, England. She became the world's first test tube baby. The scientific and medical advance of IVF gave parents who were otherwise unable to conceive another chance at procreation. The procedure has since resulted in numerous successful births. 10 years after Louise Brown was born, an infertile couple had a 1 in 10 chance to procreate using IVF technology. And 20 years later the chances had increased to 1 in 5. But as Louise Brown and her parents celebrated her 20th birthday in 1998, news stories abounded discussing the ethics of in vitro fertilization. With scientists now able to clone sheep and mice, public opinion often veered toward fear.
When was Saddam Hussein captured?
The former Iraqi leader, known for his cruelty, was caught on December 14, 2003, 8 months after the fall of Baghdad. Hussein, 1937, was found in Ad-Dor, about 9 miles from his hometown of Tikrit. He was said to be hiding like a rat, in a hole across the Tigris River from one of his palaces. His 6 to 8 foot bunker was equipped with a basic ventilation system and was camouflaged with bricks and dirt. A disheveled Hussein had in his possession about $750,000 as well as arms, which he did not use. The former dictator was taken into custody in what U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld called a surprisingly peaceful manner. Despite that, Hussein reportedly remained defiant and unrepentant when he was asked about the thousands of people killed and dumped into mass graves during his regime. He dismissed his victims as thieves. The news of his capture prompted jubilation in Baghdad and across the nation. Crowds of Iraqis flooded into the streets to celebrate the end of his brutal rule. But his hometown of Tikrit, considered a loyalist stronghold, remained quiet. The news of his capture was welcomed by leaders around the globe. In a short televised address from the White House, President Bush remarked that Hussein would face the justice he denied to millions. Bush also reassured the Iraqi people that they would not have to fear the rule of Saddam Hussein ever again. Hussein was held for questioning in Iraq. Upon the June 28, 2004, transfer of authority, Iraq was given legal custody of the former ruler, who became a criminal defendant instead of a prisoner of war.
What was the Hollywood blacklist?
In 1947, studio executives assembled at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York put together a list of alleged communist sympathizers, naming some 300 writers, directors, actors, and others known or suspected to have Communist Party affiliations or of having invoked the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination when questioned by the House Committee to investigate un-American activities. The Hollywood 10 who refused to tell the committee whether or not they had been communists were Alva Bessie, Herbert Biberman, Lester Cole, Edward Dmytryk, Ring Lardner Jr., John Howard Lawson, Albert Maltz, Samuel Ornitz, Adrian Scott, and Dalton Trumbo. The film industry blacklisted the Hollywood 10 on November 25. And all of them drew short prison sentences for refusing to testify.
What was the Boxer Rebellion?
It was a Chinese uprising in 1900, which was put down through the combined forces of 8 foreign countries including Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the United States. The Chinese-Japanese War, 1894–95, had seriously weakened China. And in 1898 the country agreed to lease its Kyoko region to Germany. Soon other European countries followed suit, and before long Western influence was being felt in China. This angered many Chinese, including members of a secret society that opposed the Manchu government for having allowed the foreign incursions. This secret society was made up of athletic young men, and so they were called Boxers by China's Westerners. Between June 21 and August 14, 1900, Boxers rebelled against anything foreign and began a raid of the country that was intended to drive out all foreign influence. The uprising was aimed at not only Westerners and foreign diplomats, but missionaries, Chinese Christians, and any Chinese who were thought to support Western ideas. Houses, schools, and churches were burned. Much of the destruction took place in Beijing. And when foreign diplomats there called for help, it arrived from 8 countries. The Manchu government did not welcome this interference in its affairs and promptly declared war on the 8 nations. On September 7, 1901, the Manchu government signed a peace settlement with the foreign countries. The Boxer Protocol called for China to punish officials who had been involved in the rebellion and pay damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The United States, Britain, and Japan later returned part of the money to China, specifying that it be used for educational purposes.
When was Microsoft founded?
It wasn't all that long ago, 1975, that computer whiz Bill Gates, 1955. Founded what is now the dominant manufacturer of computer software. So dominant that the company has faced antitrust allegations from the federal government. Gates was only 19 years old when he founded the business with his friend Paul Gardner Allen. And he had dropped out of Harvard to do so. It paid off. Gates was a billionaire by age 30. Though he's undoubtedly a math ace. He scored a perfect 800 in math on his SATs and began writing computer programs when he was all of 13. Gates has more than once credited the success of Microsoft to not his own programming skills but to hiring the best programming talent for the Redmond, Washington-based company.
What was the first scientific textbook on human anatomy?
It is a work titled On the Structure of the Human Body, written by Belgian physician and professor Andreas Vesalius. 1514 to 1564, and published in 1543, when he was in his late 20s. Like other anatomists during the Renaissance, 1350 to 1600. Vesalius conducted numerous dissections of human cadavers. Publishing his findings and drawings, his textbook soon became the authoritative reference, overturning the works of Greek physician Galen, 129 c. 199.
When was the euro introduced?
The euro, the currency of the 12 European Union nations Belgium, Germany, Greece, Spain, France, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Austria, Portugal, and Finland went into circulation January 1, 2002, becoming part of daily life for more than 300 million people. The banknotes and coins replaced national currencies, making the franc, Deutschmark, peseta, and lira, among others, history in the participating nations. The euro's origins can be traced to a series of international agreements. Beginning in 1978, which were made among the members of what was then called the European Community, or EC. In February 1986 the framework for the unified monetary system was agreed upon by nations who signed the Single European Act, creating an area without internal frontiers, in which the free movement of goods, persons, services, and capital is ensured. The 1989 Delors report outlined a plan to introduce the currency in 3 phases. The final phase of that plan began on January 1, 1999, when the 11 countries, later to become 12, belonging to the European Union established the conversion rates between their respective national currencies and the euro, creating a monetary union with a single currency. A 3-year transition phase followed, during which monetary transactions could be made in euro, but there was no requirement to do so. On January 1, 2002, the central banks of the 12 participating countries put into circulation about 7.8 billion euro notes and 40.4 billion euro coins, together worth 144 billion euros. Simultaneously each country began to withdraw its own currency from circulation. By February 28, 2002, the changeover was complete, meaning the national currencies were completely withdrawn and only the euro was in circulation. When 10 new nations, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia, joined the EU on May 1, 2004, there was no timetable for their adoption of the euro. Previously, in 2003, Sweden voted against joining the euro area.
When was instant messaging introduced?
The ability to send instant text messages over computers was introduced to the public in 1996. Internet service provider America Online, AOL, launched instant messaging, or IM, as another way for its members to communicate with each other. By logging onto a home or work computer, or cell phone with internet capabilities, users could view their buddy list and see which of their AOL contacts were online at the time. IM users could then send messages back and forth in real time, next door, or across thousands of miles. In 1997 AOL expanded the service to non-AOL users with a utility called AOL Instant Messaging, AIM, and in 1998 the company acquired another IM utility, ICQ. By 1999 MSN and Yahoo rolled out their instant messenger services, and others followed. The concept caught on, particularly with young users who embraced the concept of a private chat room. In 2004, a Pew Internet and American Life Project report estimated that 53 million Americans, or 4 out of 10 Internet users, were instant messaging. IM had become the primary form of communication for many, replacing telephone calls and emails. The mode of communication also brought about a new shorthand, or subculture language, with a heavy reliance on abbreviations and icons. The use of the technology continued to grow rapidly, expanding to practical business use. In 2004, analysts estimated that there were about 600 million registered IM users worldwide.
Where was the president on September 11?
President George W. Bush, 1946, began the day at a Sarasota, Florida, elementary school, where he was expected to speak on his education program. At 9:00 a.m. he was notified of the first plane crash into the World Trade Center's North Tower. He was preparing to make his planned speech when, a few moments later, he was told of the second crash. After consulting with advisors, he addressed the gathering at 9:30 a.m. saying there had been an apparent terrorist attack on our country. At 9:57 a.m., Air Force One, with the president on board, took off from Florida. By 10 a.m. Bush had ordered the nation's military to high alert status around the world. At 11:40 a.m., the president's plane landed at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. There he remarked to the press, "Make no mistake. The United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts." Shortly after 1 p.m., Air Force One departed Louisiana and headed to Nebraska's Offutt Air Force Base. Throughout the day the president was in contact with his top advisors, including Vice President Dick Cheney, 1941, who was reported to be in a secure location in Washington, D.C. At 4:36 p.m. the president's plane took off from Offutt to make the trip back to Washington. Bush arrived at the White House aboard presidential helicopter Marine One after Air Force One made an escorted landing at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. First Lady Laura Bush, 1946, arrived back at the White House separately via motorcade. She, too, was reportedly in a secure location throughout the day. At 8:30 p.m. the president addressed the nation via a televised broadcast from the Oval Office. In part he said, "Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror." He went on to say, "Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve." Further, he promised that the search was underway for those responsible. And he said the nation would stand with its friends and allies to win the war against terrorism. He ended his day with a national security meeting, which lasted nearly 2 hours.
What was the Battle of the Bulge?
The term refers to the December 16, 1944, German confrontation with the American forces in the Ardennes Mountains, a forested plateau range that extends from northern France into Belgium and Luxembourg. Even though Germany appeared to be beaten at this late point in the war, Hitler rallied his remaining forces and launched a surprise assault on the American soldiers in Belgium and Luxembourg. But Germany could not sustain the front, and within 2 weeks the Americans had halted the German advance near Belgium's Meuse River, south of Brussels. The offensive became known as the Battle of the Bulge, because of the protruding shape of the battleground on a map. The Ardennes were also the site of conflict earlier in World War II. In 1940, as well as in World War I, in 1914 and 1918.
Who was the first physician in history?
The first physician known by name was Imhotep, an Egyptian who lived about 2600 B. C. Also considered a sage, Imhotep lived at a time when the Egyptians were making progress in medicine. The advances included a textbook on the treatment of wounds, broken bones, and even tumors. Imhotep was later worshipped as a god by the Egyptians.
What was the Doomsday Book?
It is an important document surviving from the reign of England's William I, c. 1028–1087, a Norman who had conquered England in 1066 to become king. He ordered the survey so that he could have a complete record of England's lands, property owners, and resources. He used this information to his advantage, even taking possession of some properties thereafter. The census is considered an excellent record of Europe's Middle Ages, 500–1350.
Who coined the term Iron Curtain?
It was former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, 1874–1965. In a March 1946 speech in Fulton, Missouri, he remarked that an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The statesman, who had been instrumental in coordinating the Allied victory in World War II, 1939–45, was commenting on Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's, 1879–1953, tactics in Eastern Europe, which indicated the Soviets were putting up barriers against the West and building up Soviet domination behind those barriers. Just as he had issued warnings of the threat posed by Nazi Germany prior to World War II. Churchill astutely observed the rapidly emerging situation in Eastern Europe. In 1946 the Soviets installed communist governments in neighboring Romania and in nearby Bulgaria. In 1947 Hungary and Poland came under communist control as well. and the following year, Communists took control of Czechoslovakia. These countries, along with Albania, Yugoslavia, and East Germany, soon formed a coalition of communist allies and the Eastern Bloc was formed. The United States and its democratic allies formed the Western Bloc. The stage was set for the Cold War, 1947–89.
When was the first university established in the West?
The first modern Western university was established in the Middle Ages 1158 to be exact in Bologna, Italy. It was in that year that Frederick I, c. 1123 to 1190, Holy Roman Emperor, asserted his authority in Lombardy. He granted the first university charter for the University of Bologna, authorizing its students to organize. The universities that were set up in Europe during the Middle Ages. 500–1350, were not necessarily places or groups of buildings, they were more often groups of scholars and students. The University of Paris, which today includes the renowned Sorbonne. The university's Liberal Arts and Sciences division, soon became the largest and most famous university in Europe. The Sorbonne itself was founded in 1250 as a school of theology. It was reorganized in the 1600s. By 1500 universities had been founded throughout the continent. Of these, the ones that survive today include the universities of Cambridge and Oxford in England, those at Montpellier, Paris, and Toulouse, France, Heidelberg, Germany, Bologna, Florence, Naples, Padua, Rome, and Siena, Italy, and Salamanca, Spain. The methods and techniques developed in these early institutions set standards of academic inquiry that remain part of higher education in the world today.
How did the House of Tudor originate?
The name of a royal family that ruled England for well over a century, from 1485 to 1603, came from a Welshman, Owen Tudor, who sometime after 1422 married Catherine of Valois, 1401 to 1437, the widow of Henry V, who ruled from 1413 to 1422. The family did not come to power until Henry VII ascended the throne. Ruling from 1485 until his death in 1509, Henry VII, 1457 to 1509, ended the bitter 30-year War of the Roses, during which two noble families, the houses of Lancaster and York, had struggled against each other for control of the throne. The conflict earned its name since the badge of each house depicted a rose, one red and the other white. In taking power, Henry VII became the head of the House of Lancaster, and in 1486 he married into the House of York, thus uniting the two former enemies and founding his own Tudor dynasty. He's known as Henry Tudor.
What is the Copernican view of the universe?
The Copernican view of the universe, proposed in 1507, argued that Earth was only one of several galactic bodies that orbit the Sun. This theory, put forth by Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, Mikołaj Kopernik, 1473 to 1543, was controversial in its day because it ran counter to the astronomical beliefs that had held sway for some 1,400 years, those of the Ptolemaic system, which maintained that Earth is the center of the universe and that the Sun and the planets all revolve around it. Copernicus devised his scheme out of necessity. Really, he had found that using the Ptolemaic system to predict the positions of the planets over long periods of time yielded haphazard results. Once he made the assumption that the Sun, rather than Earth, is the center of the solar system and that all the planets orbit the Sun. Copernicus realized that tables of planetary positions could be calculated much more easily and accurately. However, Copernicus was not the first to put forth such a radical idea. The Greek astronomer Aristarchus of Samos, c. 310 to 230 BC, was the first to maintain that Earth rotates on an axis and revolves around the Sun. But it was Ptolemy's ideas that took hold, not Aristarchus's. Copernicus did, however, take the argument a step further, averring that Earth itself is small and unimportant compared with the rest of the universe. But the Copernican view had its problems, too. Copernicus assumed that the planetary orbits were perfectly circular. Because of this error, he found it necessary to use some of Ptolemy's cumbersome epicecles. Smaller orbits centered on the larger ones. To reduce the discrepancy between his predicted orbits and those that he observed. It was not until the early 1600s that the elliptical orbit of the planets was put forth by German astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630.
Why do music historians talk about before Bach and after Bach?
Some scholars use these terms to classify music history since the life work of Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685 to 1750, was so substantial, consisting of some 1,100 works, and has had lasting and profound influence on music composition. While he was not famous during his lifetime and had disagreements with employers throughout his career, J.S. Bach's works and innovations in many ways defined music as people now know it. The tempered scale is among his inventions, and he initiated a keyboard technique that is considered standard today. Chronologically, J.S. Bach marks the end of the prolific and variegated Baroque era, which began about 1600 and ended the year of his death, 1750. A devout Christian, J.S. Bach believed that all music was to the glory of God and the recreation of the human spirit. As a spiritual person and true believer in eternal life, he left behind an impressive body of church music. including 300 cantatas, or musical sermons, as well as passions and oratorios. As a devoted family man who believed all his children were born musicians, and therefore, the Bachs could stage drawing room music at any time. J.S. Bach also wrote chamber music, including instrumental concertos, suites, and overtures. Among his most well-known and beloved works are the St. Matthew Passion, Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, Sheep May Safely Graze, and his Christmas Oratorio.
When did the big band era begin?
On December 1, 1934, Benny Goodman's Let's Dance was broadcast on network radio, which effectively launched the swing era, in which big band music achieved huge popularity. Goodman, 1909 to 1986, was a virtuoso clarinetist and bandleader. His jazz-influenced dance band took the lead in making swing the most popular style of the time.
What was Operation Falcon?
It was the code name for the mid-April 2005 roundup of more than 10,000 fugitives in 1 week. The coordinated nationwide effort was led by the U.S. Marshals Service, together with officers from 960 federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. The Marshals arrested 10,340 people who were wanted for various crimes, many of them violent. The operation took place during Crime Victims' Rights Week. More than 150 of the fugitives were wanted for murder, 550 for sexual assault charges, and more than 600 for armed robberies. There were also escaped prisoners and criminal suspects among those arrested. Operation Falcon was a landmark in law enforcement because of the sheer number of arrests. Previous coordinated efforts had nabbed only hundreds of fugitives.
What happened in the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster?
The U.S. Space Shuttle Columbia was lost upon its re-entry into Earth's atmosphere on the morning of February 1, 2003. All 7 crew members died. The Columbia was in the skies over Texas about 15 minutes before its scheduled landing at Florida's Kennedy Space Center when, shortly before 9 a.m. EST, ground controllers lost data from temperature controllers on the spacecraft. Over the next several minutes, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, ground control lost all flight data. At about the same time, witnesses in Texas reported the sound of rolling thunder and debris falling from the sky. Heat detecting weather radar showed a bright red streak moving across the Texas sky. The shuttle was 40 miles above Earth and traveling at 18 times the speed of sound when it disintegrated. leaving a trail of debris from eastern Texas to western Louisiana. The investigation later revealed that damage to the spacecraft had gone unseen during the mission, causing the Columbia to break apart upon re-entry. The shuttle was commanded by Rick Husband and piloted by William McCool. The mission specialists were Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, and Laurel Clark. The payload specialist was Israeli astronaut Ilan Ramon. In President George W. Bush's remarks to the nation that day, he said, "These men and women assumed great risk in the service to all humanity. In an age when spaceflight has come to seem almost routine, it is easy to overlook the dangers of travel by rocket. These astronauts knew the dangers, and faced them willingly." The Columbia tragedy occurred within a week of the anniversaries of two other deadly NASA disasters. The Challenger explosion on January 28, 1986, and the launch pad fire that killed 3 Apollo astronauts on January 27, 1967. After investigating the cause of the Columbia disaster, NASA focused on implementing a new system of sensors to detect potentially fatal damage to spacecrafts while in orbit. NASA relaunched its Space Shuttle program in late July 2005 with the Discovery.